House, Peace Speaker of the House.
Attorney General. Attorney General.
I said general attorney.
An attorney who deals with generals.
Is it the Attorney General?
Yes.
Is to enforce the laws and the Attorney General is part of that. And I don't know if the Vice President's up to as far as enforcement goes. Yeah.
What exactly does the DOJ, like what can they enforce?
Any federal laws?
Could you give an example?
Any laws passed by the United States Congress?
I mean an example of them like acting on them.
Drugs being transported across state lines. They have no laws against that. Pursuant to the Interstate Commerce Clause. Yeah, the FBI is it's one of the law enforcement agencies of the Department of Justice. But there are also other executive enforcement agencies, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, Secret Service, Homeland Security, in a way. Yeah.
So does the Attorney General have a
Yeah.
basically
He's the Secretary of Justice.
the Solicitor General, does he really have
When the federal government is a party in court, the Solicitor General is in charge of presenting their case. So if you want your case presented well, then you look at the Solicitor General.
Okay.
It's like having a good lawyer at your trial, except in this case you're the government, representing the people. Like I said last time, different presidents have different priorities when it comes to enforcement. I guess a closer to home version is different governors of Utah give different amounts of attention to enforcing, say, anti-polygamy statutes in the state of Utah. Most choose not to make it a big deal every once in a while. Someone will. So, I was saying towards the end, priorities are the less controversial form of presidential discretion. The more controversial form is selecting certain laws not to enforce at all. And so during Barack Obama's presidency, he announced his government was no longer going to enforce the Defense of Marriage Act that had been passed in the 1990s. The Trump administration announced it wasn't going to enforce certain elements of Obamacare. And so the chief executive announces abandoning laws to enforce. That's what will get more attention and more controversy.
Alex, is there a federal marijuana ban?
Yeah, there are federal laws against marijuana, but some states have passed laws making it legal in their state, which creates division.
So would it be the DOJ's responsibility to take care of that?
And also possibly other agencies, depending on
So you could see
their enforcement.
federally charged marijuana crimes and not locally.
Theoretically, yes, I've heard a lot of it happening. Federal agents on their off weekends go to Colorado and pick up I haven't heard of it being a big issue in practice yet, but theoretically it could. Well, pursuant to being chief executive, the president has ordinance power, the power to issue executive ordinances or orders. And we've had over 14,000 executive orders now. And they're compiled in the Federal Register, so you have the U.S. Code, which is all the laws passed by Congress. The Federal Register contains all the executive orders. These are supposed to be pursuant to the Constitution or laws Congress has already passed. And often they read this way. At the beginning of an executive order, it often says something such as, by virtue of the power invested in, or wherever the authority comes from. Congress, if it wants to, can pass a law opposing an executive order, but the president could veto it. So sometimes you get these veto competitions. In addition to the public executive orders, there are also national security executive orders, which are kept secret. These didn't start to be recorded and numbered until 1907, and they only numbered back to 1862. So there are a lot of voting ones that are normally numbered. It was Reagan who gave these things the name. He titled one of them an executive order, and the name stuck. They weren't very common at first. The first Express this all together issued 18 executive orders, and then, and checks. Well, all by himself. But that's relatively few compared to now. Teddy Roosevelt was the first to go over 1,000. Surprisingly, Calvin Coolidge issued 1,203.
What would they get now?
I have a
You ever read all 1,000 of them?
only one president has never issued an executive order, was it?
Harrison?
Monroe.
Which one?
Harrison?
Yeah, which one?
It's
Henry Harrison?
Which one?
William?
Just 30 days.
That's
They're
correct.
in the same team. It doesn't matter. Thanks, Ray.
You sing it first.
Let's go, team.
Henry Harrison didn't have a lot of time.
36 years.
Of course, FDR has the record over 8,500. What was the first of FDR's executive orders?
Oh, the 90-day,
90-day
the
fiance.
90-day bank one. The closure of banks.
That's good enough. Bank holiday.
Good executive.
Whatever the heck that was.
90-day fiance.
Operation of banks. FDR also holds the record for most per year at over 300. Surprisingly, maybe not, given when he was president. Herbert Hoover second. By comparison, Donald Trump issued about 55 a year, and Joe Biden about 38 a year. So it's come down significantly. Another team point, the most famous executive order ever.
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation?
Emancipation Proclamation.
Good girl.
Yes. But they're both the executive orders. FDR also issued one requiring the surrender of gold from private hands during the early Depression or during the presidency of the Depression. So there could be punishments. I guess one of the initial orders helped set up the Manhattan Project, which will have some further consequences.
Japanese internment.
And there it is, 1966, Japanese internment. But it was issued under a certain set of circumstances, not long after Pearl Harbor. No one in the country thought it was possible for the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor. So when they did, and did so successfully, then just about everything seemed possible. Bombing the West Coast, invading the West Coast, and that's the atmosphere in which it was issued. Oh, another team point. Who was the Attorney General in California when this was carried out? Yeah, that kind of quip might get a response in regular classes, but not the AP class. No, it was Earl Warren, who later on be appointed Chief Justice and will become famous for extending individual rights and liberties through the court. And so he went from a sort of law and order Attorney General, being maybe our most liberal Chief Justice ever. Also, though, it reminds us that executive orders are appealable, and so there were a couple of cases that went through the courts. And in both cases, the Supreme Court narrowly upheld the executive orders as legitimate exercise of presidential power under those circumstances. Later, though, administrations haven't always agreed, and so in the 1980s, under Reagan, there was an official apology, and under the first Bush, there was a cash payment, $10,000. What did Harry Truman's Order 9148 do?
Integrated armed services.
That is right. Desegregated military.
Did you actually know that, or did you just take a guess?
Right there.
Right there.
Where do you
You
start?
have it on purpose. I cannot read that.
I mean, I can't read it.
She's smack in the middle, right in front of you.
However,
I'm just flying.
Harry Truman was not always successful. Which executive order of his was struck down as unconstitutional? You don't give me the numbers. Just a second.
Thinking Korea.
I didn't do that.
That's why it was struck down.
That's not why there's K-pop now.
Ooh.
It's not.
Ooh, no.
Well, I was trying to seize control of the steel industry during the Korean War. Because of
Something to do with Korea.
war effort. Yeah, that's why I asked the question. I like to make these at least realistic, even if they are improbable. And the only other recent executive order that's been struck down by the Supreme Court was Bill Clinton in 1996. He tried to prevent the U.S. from making contracts with companies that had strike breakers on their payrolls. But the Supreme Court said that went too far. Other notable ones recently, LBJ's 11130 set up a Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of JFK. Barack Obama, 13493, called for, this is his first year in office, called for a review of the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and resolved that that prison would be closed within a year. Almost 8 years later, at the end of his presidency, it was still open.
Is it open right now?
Still in
Yep.
use. Yeah, I think so.
It's still open.
It's still open. I don't know if they're adding new people.
Yeah, I doubt they're adding, but they're still holding. And Donald Trump signed an executive order saying that it would remain open indefinitely. But of course, Joe Biden has had his opportunity, but hasn't done it. And then most recently, Donald Trump's 13769 banned immigrants from certain Muslim majority countries. And that one was stayed by a federal court, and then a redrafted order was mostly upheld by the Supreme Court.
What does stay mean?
Put on hold.
So they're saying it's not unconstitutional, but it's not constitutional?
Yeah, changes need to be made. If this is going to make it. Any changes were made. Orders are sometimes used to carry out presidential preferences. And so George W. Bush gave an executive order authorizing faith-based initiatives that government money could be distributed to faith-based charitable organizations, whereas before that had been limited. Barack Obama in 2014 issued an executive order shielding 5 million what's?
Immigrants.
Specifically
Mexicans.
dreamers
Canadian.
from prosecution. And what'll often happen, and I'm sure we'll see it in the next few months, is executive orders expressing preferences over things like federal money being used to fund abortions. And so when Republicans were in office, usually very early in the presidency, there were executive orders restricting that, and when a Democrat comes into the White House, countervailing executive orders, authorizing that more than before. So anything else on the ordinance power? Significant power altogether. Another executive power is the appointment power. As mighty as the president might be, he can't do it all himself. And the appointment power was a little novel at the time of the Constitution. The governors of most states had executive councils chosen by the legislature. There was great distrust of executives choosing their own cabinets because of perceived abuses by the British. With the appointment power, it comes with the advice and consent from the Senate. We've already seen that in the new nation, the question was, did the Senate have to consent if a president wanted to fire a cabinet official? And they decided no, because the cabinet official should be responsive to the president more than to the Senate. But as we're seeing now, advice and consent can remain controversial. There's something called senatorial courtesy. And senatorial courtesy means that when a senator from the state of the nominee objects to that nominee, then other senators will vote against that nominee as well. And sometimes this has been formalized by something known as the blue slip. It's a paper sent to the senators from the state where the nominees are going to come from, and they should return the blue slip if they have any issues with that nominee. It's a way to magnify the advice part of advice and consent. A way of saying if the president's going to pick someone from a certain state, then you should clear it with those senators. Definitely if those senators are from the same party. But even if they're not from the same party, they should at least be asked. These traditions, like many others in Congress, have broken down somewhat in recent years. They're still subject to it. Well, here it is. Federal bureaucracy. There's the judicial and the legislative, relatively small. The rest is the executive. And so, the president, we have to be careful when it comes to the appointment power. The president in general is appointing the top levels of all of these, but under different circumstances. And so we start with the White House office, which are the president's closest advisors. We'll see more about them in the bureaucracy. The president can choose all these people without Senate confirmation. This is the equivalent of what was called during Andrew Jackson's time. Jackson would consult with friends, associates who weren't part of the cabinet. This was called his kitchen cabinet. Well, now it's been institutionalized. These are the president's most senior policy advisors in the White House office. That's part of the executive office of the president, which is made up of all these agencies. And when it comes to these other agencies, then often there is consent required from the Senate, such as the head of the National Security Agency, the National Security Council, and others. Cabinet officials have to be consented to, and often many of the chief directors under the secretaries are also appointed and confirmed. With the independent agencies, part of what makes them independent is how they're appointed. Often the president will appoint the leaders, and they have to be confirmed, but they have a guaranteed time in office where they can't be removed, or if they can, the removal is outside the complete control of the president. So it's not like the cabinet officers who can be fired at will without the consent of the Senate. There are things built into the law that guarantee tenure to the heads of many of those offices, which is another reason we call them independent. But the first reason is because they're not part of the executive department. So appointment can vary depending on where it is. Now we talked about recess appointments before. The original intention is just practicality, part which is out of session. Most of 7 years it is hard to duplicate. And so the controversial current use is for political reasons to get by the Senate. Which have become more common since the second George Bush and Barack Obama, before the Supreme Court put limits on it. And speaking of which, has anything been going on politically that we should know about? It's been a while since I've asked you that question. Yeah.
Matt Gaetz stepped down as the Attorney General.
And that's more Matt Gaetz.
I'm not familiar with him, but it was the former Florida
Pamba.
Attorney General. Like she has the judgment.
Well, what do you think about Gaetz withdrawing?
I think it's a good thing. He like, have the experience being Attorney General. And
So you want someone more qualified?
like the new pick who was an Attorney General and was a lawyer and kind of did it.
Or you can handle it before. You can trade with it. A lot of people thoughts on Gates' withdrawal?
Adam,
Yep.
Gates say why?
I said he did not want to be a distraction to the Trump agenda, which deserves to hit the ground running. What's the reason underneath that stated reason?
He's being investigated for.
Well, yeah, that's going on too, but when Gates withdraws, when does he admit?
That he probably wouldn't get confirmed.
Yeah, he's been around these senators, he's had meetings with a number of them, so he's really saying, I don't have the votes. Which brings up the question, is this just incompetence by the incoming president to choose someone? When it's pretty obvious he would not have the votes to get in, given his past record and the rest, or is something else going on here?
Framing his picks of just people who are loyal.
And why would he pick someone loyal to him if he knows or should know that he's not actually going to serve in the office?
He's probably just like branch out, be like, I'm cool with you, you can be my cabinet, even though you might not be confirmed, but I think you should be in my cabinet.
And if it is a form of loyalty to supporter Matt Gaetz, maybe it was crafted that way from the beginning. Like you said, he's been investigated. The House Ethics Committee was set to release that report, but because he got appointed, he withdrew from the House, which gave a better chance of putting a lid on that report, which may not come out at all now. And then he withdrew from consideration. So is it possible that Bondi was Trump's choice all along, that he's just doing a favor to a supporter, getting him off the hot seat here, and able to give him some public cover? If he stayed in Congress and waited for the report to come out, that would be a very different situation. And he has said significantly that he is not going to go back to Congress. Even though he probably could make that claim. Any other things on the Gates withdrawal? Yeah.
Apparently he's doing holiday wishes and stuff on Cameo now.
Oh, yeah. No, I expect him to keep a very public persona. It's what
I figured out, I was listening to radio this week, minimum price is $550.
That's like Cameo?
For Cameo things, yeah.
550?
Yeah, I think so, that's what it said.
Wait, what do you mean minimum price?
That's a
Like
cool
Cameo
info.
videos.
You can
Matt
buy
Gaetz.
a video
Buy a
of, like,
video of
saying
Matt
Merry
Gaetz
Christmas
saying
or
happy
something.
birthday.
Yeah.
Very personal.
Or, yeah,
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 personalized
you can
message.
have them say pretty much anything.
The poor guy's got to make a living. Even though he comes from a pretty well-off family.
Hey, if everybody puts like
So I wonder how much would you charge if you were on
$15 in,
Cameo?
The average length of each video is
The
about
question would be, how much would people have to pay me to get on? Yeah, I guess that's what the question is.
Yeah.
I don't know, there ought to be a startup charge to even persuade me to go on in the first place.
we got a problem there, guys.
Let's petition for
It's
it.
not gonna happen.
Change.org.
I can just use AI and I'll just make a video. All those lectures, I've gotten the voice.
Facts.
Anything else going on we should know about?
Hey,
Yep.
Pete Hegseth is being, and I think he was being investigated for like sexual assault. Yeah.
So there are questions. And one thing that usually happens in the appointment process is the FBI will do background checks and the campaign will do investigations that are known, they'll vet the candidates as it's called, just to try and make sure there aren't too many damaging things in their background. I'm not sure the Trump campaign is following those regular channels. They still haven't signed all the papers to do the regular transition of power. And so they may not be giving the same level of scrutiny to these candidates, because normally something like that would raise a flag before the appointment's made. Or it may be that Donald Trump doesn't care. He wants people loyal to him, and so it doesn't matter what their background is. How damaging are the allegations? Did they definitely happen?
No. From what I heard is that it's confirmed that he had sexual relations with a woman who was married, and he was married at the time.
Is that a crime?
It's not a crime, but then after the fact, she's now claiming that it was rape.
But
Okay, yeah.
like
Is there a conviction of that crime?
I don't remember.
I don't think so.
Something that there's no
no connection.
definite yes or no, because some videos show that like contradicting claims to what she was
Videos?
making. Because she said that he got her drunk and it was just not really consensual, and there's videos of her very much not drunk with him, like just going out with him or something. There's
It's more consensual.
so
I think one thing is known is that didn't he agree to paying her a settlement so that she wouldn't bring the suit publicly? So that's another act you could read in at least a couple different ways. And that's just one dimension. The other dimension of the except nomination is qualifications again. Is he done that apparently to run the military in the United States? Which seems to be another of the preferences of President Trump is TV-ready cabinet officials, or at least those he's become familiar with on TV.
Joe Rogan.
And breaking into the new world of podcast. Moved for years now. Anything else on appointee Hegseth? Sounds like a Harry Potter character.
Hagrid.
Anything else going on that you know about?
Alex, the Onion bought Infowars.
Oh, did they finish the deal? And why did they buy it? They want to continue its mission?
I think they have the support of, yes, it's true. They have the support of the parents of the victims of the Sandy Hook shooting, and I think they're just gonna repurpose it as another, like,
well,
funny satire.
so that's what they're gonna do. They're just gonna same exact stuff, but in more satirical sense.
So we make it all a joke
Yeah.
instead of saying
To kind of tarnish the Alex Jones and his defamatory statements.
One nice thing about studying government and politics is what they publish on the Onion is a lot funnier. One thing that happened maybe just recently is Special Counsel Jack Smith filed a motion to do away with the charges against former President Trump in his actions on January 6th. Saying he still believed in the charges, but he understands it's current Justice Department policy not to prosecute sitting presidents. Any thoughts on that story?
That's going to be controversial.
Yeah.
Ruth Room, nothing
Yeah.
they can do.
I mean, I'm not saying this was Trump's only, like, motivation to run for president again, but, like, you know, he did a good job in delaying, like, I don't know, running for president and then delaying all of the criminal charges against him.
Until he's the chief executive
Yeah.
again?
And can just get rid of all of them, because
But keep in mind, he can only, and I guess I should say this when we get to the pardoning power, that only extends to breaches of federal law.
True.
Not the states or the
States,
Georgia
yes.
cases. The Georgia case and the New York convictions.
What would
With the New York case.
so what would like DC be? Like if you like does DC follow just only federal laws or does DC have like its own?
Are you using an abbreviation for my name again?
As in the District of Columbia, and not as in David Kirkland.
They're under the control of Congress. But they have their own government under Congress. For pardon purposes?
Yeah.
I'm not sure where that would fall. That's an interesting one. No one's ever tried it.
So now I see.
There are arguments both ways. We talked about the inherent powers of the presidency. There are certain powers that just come with being president. So I think there may be inherent limits to the pardoning power didn't have to be stated. But there are others who maintain it's complete for any federal laws, so the president could pardon himself.
Like, imagine, you know, you're smoking weed and like, I pardon myself. Just think of, is that something George Washington would have done?
No, George just grew it.
I'm just saying, if the president could pardon himself, he could like be smoking marijuana and like, you know, he'd be like, I pardon myself.
It's like a kid in the back row.
Let's move on to the powers of the president. In addition to the appointing power, the president has the removal power. Except for some of the heads of the independent agencies, and the special prosecutor is outside the removal power of the president. As which president learned the hard way?
Nixon.
Nixon, once again. I ask the Nixon question every day. It's such an important study in presidential power. This brings us to the pardoning power. And the Lord said no story. Here's what it says in Article 2, Section 2 goes. The president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of
Treason. No.
Crimes or treason.
impeachment.
Impeachment.
Congress impeaches the president will pardon those offenses. Now, you don't have to be convicted to be pardoned. And so the famous Ford pardon, for any crimes Nixon may have committed, our president yet even been brought to trial. And so it could be any, it could be before, it could be during, it could be after, someone could be serving time, and have the rest of the sentence commuted. Their record can be expunged from any convictions. It's pretty sweeping power. Yeah.
And a president pardon someone, like, let's say like there was like some president after Ford and like new information came about Novak that makes it good. Could the president be like, oh, I want to undo Ford's pardon?
I don't know that's ever been tried, but I doubt it. I think according to the rules of double jeopardy, the pardon terminates that case. And if you're going to prosecute someone after that, then you have to come up with new charges.
Mr.
So in the case with Missouri said of any possible ones, but does that cover like if new information comes out and someone tries to do a new charge against him, would that still be
Yeah, I
covered
guess
by
so.
the sweeping
That's pretty
statement?
sweeping.
So like even if it like came out after that Nixon had done like something really, really bad, like murder someone or like
Covers murderers or bullets. That's what Muskie wound up. I think it covers what it says it covers. Unfortunately, you haven't had to investigate that very well.
Hey,
Now, yeah.
could you like pardon future crimes?
So
So, like,
never let this.
Let's say you're planning, you're the president, and your buddy Jimmy is like, hey, I really want to smoke some weed. Could you just be like, I pardon Jimmy for any crimes
That he ever does.
involving marijuana that he may or may not commit?
Theoretically, yes.
Premeditated
Practically,
smoking.
we haven't really seen it.
Adam, if a president can pardon themselves, could a president pardon themselves for any crimes they may or may not commit in the future and make it so they're afford declaring themselves under federal law?
And why
That's
not
not- that's not
move
true.
on their posterity as well?
Every single
Yeah,
time.
No, it's Nixon's pardon.
What?
They would decide to smoke weed
For
on
any
target.
crimes you may have committed while president.
Don't smoke weed.
So it's a
Better not.
certain area in the past.
You're pardoned.
But it does protect from potential future prosecution, but not for acts you might do in the future. Of course, what any president runs into here is public opinion. So here's the way it's normally gone. There's an office of the pardon attorney, which usually receives the appeals and then will make recommendations to the president. Presidents might issue pardons during their term. Often there's a burst right at the end, right when they're about to leave office, and some of the most controversial ones come out then. Oh, by the way, the person pardoned does not have to accept the pardon. They can reject it. And one other thing is, if you do accept the pardon, that does not necessarily mean you're admitting guilt in that case. So it's a nice deal all the way around if you can get it. Once again, the controversy comes when presidents are accused of pardoning for political reasons rather than considerations of justice. A few examples from the past. Washington gave the first high-profile pardon when on his final day in office. He pardoned which people? The Whiskey Rebellion leaders, right? Andrew Johnson pardoned thousands of former Confederate officials. Jimmy Carter granted a lot of pardons to what kind of people? Draft dodgers from Vietnam. George Bush the First pardoned 6 members of the Reagan administration who had been involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. Bill Clinton pardoned 140 on his last day, including a billionaire fugitive named Mark Rich, who had been accused of tax evasion and fraud and fled to Europe. He gave a lot of money to the Democratic Party on the last day of the Clinton administration. He got pardoned. But Bill Clinton also pardoned his half-brother Roger Clinton for certain drug offenses.
Joe Biden.
Barack Obama pardoned, well, he commuted the sentences of over 1,700, most convicted on drug charges. Sort of the consequences of 3 strikes and you're out of policy. Excessive. Donald Trump pardoned a number of people convicted of crimes while working for him. And so his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, his former security advisor, what's his name? I see his face. Now a conspiracy theorist. I don't know, but they've been convicted of not telling the truth under oath to federal officials and were sent to prison. Trump pardoned them. Oh, and his son-in-law's father, Charles Kushner, Jared's father, is a financial I don't know what Jared was, but his father had it. So that's the thing to watch out for, is political use. The power was originally given to try and create a better chance of justice. So at least another avenue for it. And then I guess the last executive power, although this goes along with foreign policy, is executive privilege. The president can keep this from Congress and from the country. That's the nature of So the first high-profile case of this is when Jeffersonians despised Jay's Treaty so much that they insisted that Washington turn over the papers related to the negotiation of the treaty, because they thought John Jay had sold the country out to the British. Washington refused. He felt insulted by the request. And there have been various uses since. Most famously, Nixon claimed he didn't have to turn over tapes that were recorded of Oval Office conversations because of national security. But as I've said before, U.S. versus Nixon, unanimous ruling said it was more personal instead of national security. So they had to turn them over, and they decided that would be a good time to resign. What was the incriminating part of the tapes called?
Smoking gun.
Smoking gun. It was revealed in a conversation he had with his chief of staff that he knew about the break-ins, the Watergate complex. And while it didn't show that he had planned them, it did show that he and his chief of staff conspired to obstruct justice, to cover up the investigation. And so all along he'd been telling the country he didn't know anything about these break-ins. He was determined that those responsible be brought to justice, and all he wanted to do was be busy with the business of the American people. The tape showed that at least most of that was not true. Executive privilege was further weakened during Bill Clinton's term, as it was determined that not only can't the president keep certain personal things secret, but Secret Service and staff members can be compelled to testify if it seems reasonable that they have evidence in the case. Which brings us to one of the more interesting moments in federal government history. January 20th, 1997. 7 days earlier, oral arguments that had been given in the case of Clinton versus Jones, one of the most damaging prosecutions of Bill Clinton. And so the Chief Justice, Rehnquist, on January 20th, gave the oath of office to Bill Clinton for the second term. And then right after Bill Clinton had said it, Rehnquist said to him, "Good luck, you'll need it." Rehnquist, of course, will sit as the presiding official in Bill Clinton's impeachment trial later in the term. So anything else about the executive powers of the president? All of those powers fit within his role as chief law enforcer. You may be happy to know the other powers go faster. The second big group is legislative powers. And keep in mind, the president has a different situation than, say, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister is the head of the majority party of the House of Commons. So a Prime Minister can be reasonably assured that he's going to be able to enact his program, as they put it over there. We'll see more of it later this year. In other words, he can get enough support for his legislative priorities. The president has no such guarantee. Donald Trump has fairly rare opportunity, not a unique one, controlling the House and the Senate, but not with very large majorities. And so will that be enough to get everything through? We'll see. But the president has a number of powers and responsibilities related to legislation. The State of the Union address is in the Constitution. And Washington and Adams delivered it to Congress in person, but starting with Thomas Jefferson, it was delivered in written form to be read to Congress, but not said by the president. And that continued from Jefferson all the way through Taft. Taft. And then the presidents, starting with Wilson, began delivering the message in person again, which sets up the drama. Let's see, are they going to say it this year in the inauguration year? I think so.
Yeah.
The president giving the address to the combined houses of Congress and whatever Supreme Court justices want to attend. And then behind the president is the vice president. And then there's also the Speaker of the House as the heads of the two houses of Congress. And if the Speaker of the House is from the opposite party, that's when you get the major visual problem. So the president will say something, the vice president very quickly applauds and often stands up. And if the Speaker of the House is from the other party, or sometimes no applause at all, but if it's about soldiers or national defense, then they'll usually stand up a little slower than the vice president. And of course, the drama has gotten bigger in later years because of just matters of decorum. That sometimes members of Congress in the audience don't behave themselves terribly well, and will yell out or speak out. But sometimes presidents will sort of bait the opposite party too, and kind of antagonize them in what they say. So neither party is completely innocent here. Usually what the State of the Union is a patriotic beginning, the State of the Union is strong. Remember Franklin Roosevelt wrote that during the Great Depression. While the economy may not be, the State of the Union is strong. Yay. And then there will be a list of various policy priorities that sound really good but have little chance of passing, depending on the makeup of Congress. Aside from the State of the Union, presidents often give policy messages and often will oversee drafting of important and detailed legislation. And then the president operates as a consensus builder for important legislation, and here's where the ability to work with Congress is crucial to a president's success. And some presidents are better than others, and it's hard to predict who's who. Of course, one of the masterful performances is Lyndon Johnson, as he took over from Kennedy and then up through his re-election in 1964. Just a slew of great society programs, because Johnson had not only been in Congress, he'd been the majority leader of the Senate for a long time, and so he was the consummate insider in Congress, making the deals, getting the votes, and that turned out to be valuable to him as president. Maybe his opposite was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter came to the White House as the anti-Nixon, probably the only combination of forces that could have allowed Carter to win the presidency without any Washington experience was Watergate. Carter said he'd be honest, which the country wanted after Nixon, and the country seemed to want someone who wasn't part of the Washington inside status that they associated Watergate with. So that was great in campaigning to help him get elected. When it came to working with Congress, it was not so great. Carter also had majority control of both houses of Congress, but didn't know how to work with them very well. Didn't understand that members of Congress considered themselves individually to be important. They needed to be negotiated with. Carter thought just the righteousness of the idea should be enough to get something through. So he did not have the most distinguished legislative record. And then similarly, Bill Clinton came into office in '93 with majority control of both the House and the Senate, and he felt a mission to get universal health care coverage through, something the Democrats had wanted since at least Harry Truman. And to show how important that priority was, he put his wife in charge of the effort, Hillary Clinton, the first lady, with a specific legislative mission, and they couldn't get it through. Democrats were too divided on the issue to get passage. Someone surprisingly good at working with Congress was Ronald Reagan, another Washington outsider. When he arrived in 1981, but he understood the importance of human relationships, and so he got along really well with Democrat Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. They had almost opposite legislative agendas, but they got along personally very well, and that pleased O'Neill for at least some of what Reagan wanted to get through, and many thought it would be impossible given the Democratic majority in the House. Another power is the president can call special sessions of Congress. That doesn't happen so much when Congress is perpetually in session. Maybe the most famous special session was the Civil War. When Lincoln came to office in March, Congress had a short session and then went home. Lincoln called them back into session in the summer. They weren't supposed to be in session until December that year, after Fort Sumter being raised troops. The president can set the date for adjournment when houses of Congress disagree. That has been little used. Some of you might have seen that Donald Trump has speculated that if the House and the Senate can't agree when they're going to adjourn, that he can decide, and he can make sure it's at least 10 days so he can get in some recess appointments. You'd think, well, they're both controlled by Republicans, so they'd be happy to go along with it, except that the House and the Senate each have their own institutional histories and their own traditions. And I don't know that they can be expected to give up power just from the president who wants to get his agenda through. It would show really strong loyalty to the president personally and really strong partisanship if any scheme like that ever happened. It'd be pretty surprising. And then along with his legislative powers is his veto power. Again, kind of strange at the time the Constitution was written because 11 states denied their governor's veto power back in the 1780s. A lot of times we'll track vetoes like this. And this one only goes through Clinton. You've got regular vetoes, pocket vetoes, and then how many are overridden.
Andrew Johnson got cooked.
Well, because Congress is not going to but keep in mind that there's the threatened veto. And so, for example, in the NBA, they keep track of block shots as a statistic. Until recently, they haven't kept the statistic of altered shots, and even now it's kind of unofficial. But if you play in basketball, you know that if you're going up for a shot and someone tall looks like they're going to block it, you might change your shot to give it no chance of going in just so it won't get blocked. So when a president threatens to veto, we don't know how many times that's caused members of Congress to amend, alter bills to try and avoid the veto itself. And so the influence of the veto power is bigger than shows up on this chart. The first presidents vetoed only bills they considered to be unconstitutional. That's why it was such a big deal when Washington signed the first Bank of the United States. It was his show that he considered that bank and the broad construction on which it was based to be constitutional.
Adam,
Yeah.
what were Washington's two vetoes?
I don't know. I thought I looked into this. And then Andrew Jackson started vetoing laws that he just didn't like. What was the most famous veto?
Bank of the United States.
The first or the second?
Second, the renewal.
But still, before the Civil War, there weren't too many vetoes. The Civil War, the disagreements over Reconstruction changed that. And then there are a lot of other consequences in the war. So Grover Cleveland is vetoing a lot of private pension bills for people he thinks don't deserve army pensions. And FDR does a lot of vetoing. Certain presidents have quite a few.
Why does Truman and Eisenhower have so many?
Usually adversarial positions with Congress. Even though Truman's a Democrat and much of Congress is Democrat, they got waivers, so the Republicans get a majority halfway through his presidency and then lose it again. And not all Democrats agree with Truman and vice versa.
Hey,
And then Eisenhower's a Republican at the time, and the Democrats generally control Congress.
is that like the same reasoning for Cleveland having 414 in his first term?
Cleveland, like I said, is mostly private pension bills, and so Republicans will vote Civil War pensions. Sometimes the people who didn't actually do a lot of service in the Civil War, maybe did no service at all, but somehow wheedled their way into the Republican favor. And so it's usually against bills he thinks are fraudulent. So the Civil War changes a lot, one way or another. The override rate is only about 4%. And the first presidential override was not until John Tyler. The first significant bill to be overridden wasn't until 1866. So it doesn't happen very often. Presidents usually don't like it to happen. Barack Obama had 12 vetoes, although one was overridden. It's the law allowing U.S. families in 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia. President Obama vetoed not only because he thought it would complicate relations with Saudi Arabia, but he thought that there might be consequences for U.S. military personnel. At the time, Donald Trump had 10 regular vetoes, one overridden. He vetoed the National Defense Authorization Act, one of the big spending bills in his last year. And Congress overrode him to pass it. Joe Biden, 12 vetoes so far, 0 overridden. Another power the presidents used to have related to the legislature was the impoundment of funds. This was considered an inherent power of the presidency for most of our history. Just because Congress appropriates it doesn't mean the president has to spend it. And so Jefferson refused to spend money appropriated to build frigates, naval warships. He thought those would get us into trouble. JFK refused to spend money on new weapon systems he didn't like. But Nixon, once again, was the champion. Republican of the Democratic Congress. He wanted to keep the federal budget under $250 billion, so he didn't spend a lot of money that Congress appropriated. So the Democratic Congress passed the Budget and Impoundment Control Act in 1974, part of that package along with the War Powers Act and others to rein in the imperial presidency. And that forbade this practice. Congress appropriates the money, the president has to spend it unless Congress gives a specific approval not to spend it within a 45-day period. The president will say he doesn't plan to spend it. So it sounds a lot like the War Powers Act. This one was more effective than that one. And generally, presidents haven't impounded funds since. That law also established the Congressional Budget Office to make estimates for Congress about how much certain bills will cost. This helped lead to what temporary power of the president in the 1990s. The president could no longer impound funds he didn't want to spend. The budget, OMB. This time. The line item veto. This was brought about by the Newt Gingrich contract with America Republicans in Congress when they came in the 94 election. They were very big on balancing the budget, so they thought it would be very helpful for any president, Republican or Democrat, to be able to strike down certain parts of these massive spending bills as wasteful, to cut out some of the pork barreling that was going on. And so, even though there was a Democratic president at the time, the Republicans in Congress passed the Line Item Veto Act, and Bill Clinton used it 82 times. Until 2 years later, in 1998, in the case of Clinton versus New York City, the Supreme Court overturned the Line Item Veto. 63 ruling was unconstitutional. Since Congress overreached its authority when they gave them the line item veto in the first place, it would require a constitutional amendment. The Supreme Court said to make that happen. Almost every recent president and many members of Congress have regretted the loss of the impoundment of funds as a presidential check, or at least as a presidential bargaining tool with Congress. He can't refuse to spend funds, he loses some flexibility, and more money gets spent. Governors in 43 states have the impoundment power, but not the President of the United States. Another power presidents have given to themselves, especially in recent years, is something called signing statements. When the president signs a bill, he of course signs his name, and that's the official act. From the beginning, presidents have signed other things, usually congratulatory messages. This law is long overdue, or I look forward to seeing what this will do for the country. Things like that. But this gets controversial when presidents in their signing statements try to give interpretations to the laws or even instructions on how to enforce it, or even warnings that they don't plan on enforcing it. So sometimes they'll give directions to the executive agencies that have responsibility for enforcement. Sometimes they'll try to clarify terms in the law they think are vague, or give other direction. These signing statements have no legal force by themselves, but they can often be influential to the federal agencies that will do the enforcing, since they're coming from the chief executive. First used by James Monroe, only 75 of them until Ronald Reagan, but Reagan, the first Bush, and Clinton made over 850 of them.
Each or total?
All together. And these statements coincide with the school of thought regarding presidential power called the unitary executive, which means the president has more powers than they normally exercise. Justice of the Supreme Court Samuel Alito, before he was on the Supreme Court, while he was working for the Justice Department, advocated the unitary executive and signing statements as a way to express it. Vice President Dick Cheney under the second George Bush was a fan of this school of thought as well. So George Bush II will use a lot of them too, almost 200 just by himself. Opponents said George W. Bush used signing statements like line item vetoes, announcing which parts of the law he just signed he was not going to enforce. Opponents think that these make presidents like the Supreme Court, interpreters of the law rather than just executing it. And the American Bar Association, the Lawyers Association, felt strongly in 2006. They wrote, this practice is contrary to the rule of law and our constitutional order. The Constitution is not what the president says it is. Went on to say the president should veto the entire law if he disagrees with parts of it. Well, maybe not surprisingly, Barack Obama criticized President Bush II for his use of signing statements as a clear abuse of presidential power, and said he would not use signing statements to undermine Congress's will. He did make fewer of them, only 37, but some of them still tried to do some interpreting. Donald Trump had 60 signing statements in his first term. I don't know how many Joe Biden's had. Indirectly, presidents influence the composition of legislatures through what effect? Related to it.
Oh, the effect of the midterm, where like the president's party loses power.
Surge in economy.
And what's the opposite of midterm?
Presidential mandate of power?
Yeah, what's that called when it comes to composition of the legislature?
Surge in decline.
That's part of that. Ooh, suspense?
Oh, no, I'm not.
It's called the coattail effect.